Hello, and welcome to our mini lectures on the German home front during World War One. In this series, we'll be going through a chronological overview of what was happening on the German home front, pointing out some key social, economic, and political issues. We can make some contrast with the British home front as well, but we really want to focus on understanding some of the key events and some of the key ways that government was organising itself and its civilians during World War One. Just reflecting again on the system of government in charge of Germany, because this does make a difference as to how it's run. Of course, Germany is an autocratic government headed by the very militaristic Kaiser Wilhelm II. Now, the whole government is pretty much hand-picked by the Kaiser to work with him. So all of the German government ministers are very much hand-picked and work very closely under the guidance of Kaiser Wilhelm II. Also, the German armed forces report in to the Kaiser. So all of the generals will, of course, have had their own military experience and have been promoted through the ranks of the army, but are subordinate to the Kaiser. He is officially the head of the army. And this is an interesting thing that we'll see shift as the war goes on. Also in the German system of government, we have the Reichstag, the parliament, which is, of course, elected, but has very, very limited power. Therefore, we can't really say that Germany was a democracy, although it did have a chance to elect its Reichstag. Interestingly, to reflect on, the major party in the Reichstag in 1914 was the Socialist Democratic Party, a Marxist party. And at the time, they were led by Friedrich Ebert, and his name will come back again later on. It's interesting to understand, however, that the Social Democratic Party had both a more conservative side, including Ebert, who was a more conservative socialist, but it also contained some quite radical socialists in their ideas. And towards the end of the war, we see some of those more radical socialists really starting to take a bit of a lead in what was happening on the German home front. At the outbreak of war in Germany, as we saw in many other countries, the Germans pretty much greeted the war with enthusiasm. And here we've got a shot of some Prussian infantry guard leaving Berlin, being given flowers by a woman on their way out of Berlin. Many in Germany believed that Germany had been forced into the war. We need to understand that mindset, because if you are a country that feels that you've been pressured all around you into taking action, then you feel that really you are playing a defensive role. Even though you might make the first attack, if you feel you've been pressured into that situation, then you feel justified in fighting the war and feel like you're actually defending your homeland. Even the Socialist Party in Germany, the conservative element of the Socialist Party, also initially supported the war and passed the laws that were needed in order to, get money to fund the war effort. That doesn't mean that every single person in Germany loved war and were ready to fight. Certainly the more radical socialists were having anti-war rallies as early as July 1914. But we need to understand that generally there is a very strong support for the war very early on. And this is propelled forward by propaganda and campaigns, particularly anti-British campaigns. And we can see here, this is another shot of, more exuberant soldiers going off to war very early on, reflecting that more positive attitude at the beginning of the war. But if we look at some of the propaganda, which is aimed to exacerbate anti-British feeling and garner support for the German feeling, the German war effort. And even though these particular posters you're seeing here, some are from a little bit later in the war, they use this saying, Gott strafe England. You can see it on each of these posters, which means may God punish England. And we can see here the use of the Christian God on the German side, but also these quite violent images to portray the attitude, the feeling that Germans should have towards the British. We've got this one on the right, almost like a Teutonic knight ready to defend Germany and attack the British. Similar kind of old Teutonic image here. And this one here in the middle, quite impressive, is a Medusa. See, with the snakes, a gorgon of some kind that is going to go and punish Britain on behalf of the Germans. As we also saw in Britain, in Germany, anybody that's got an English name or cafes, shops that have English names were very much attacked, and we see a huge euphoric feeling to support Germany in the war. And that feeling that we can see at the outbreak of war is referred to as the spirit of 1914. We can see here that saying, Gott strafe England, is actually also used on the battlefield, not only on the home front. Germany really going into the war was probably the best prepared country for war. It had a massive manufacturing industry and had also built up good reserves of coal and iron, and had certainly also built up a stockpile of munitions. Germany could feed itself, so it was agriculturally able to sustain itself, but this only happened if they had good harvests. And also one of the things they were reliant on was the use of chemical fertilizers. But they needed to import some of the chemicals that they used to create the fertilizers. So Germany really, while being self-sufficient in 1914 agriculturally, was dependent on trade to bring in large quantities of raw materials that they would need if they were to, continue to build into a large war effort. So things like coal, for example, they may need to bring in more, and the chemicals for the fertilizer that we talked about. If you don't have the fertilizers, then your agricultural output, the amount of harvest that you get, decreases. And so Germany was dependent on that import of fertilizer. 1 week into the war, Germany quite early set up a Department of Raw Materials, which is, when you reflect to the German name, we can use the acronym KRA for the Department of Raw Materials. And this was set up quite early in Germany by a guy called Walter Rathenau, a German industrialist, also happened to have a Jewish background. And he was exceptional really at organising industry and ensuring that the raw materials already inside Germany would be used as effectively as possible. So the Germans organised themselves to try to organise their raw materials a lot more quickly than Britain did. As an interesting aside, Walter Rathenau didn't stay in charge of the Department of Raw Materials for very long. There were some people who were concerned about his Jewish background, but he did have a very important contribution to the German home front early on in the war. The other thing to note is that we did have conscription in Germany. However, there are still recruitment posters and recruitment campaigns that go on, because you were conscripted from the age of 21, but you could go off to fight from the age of 18. Also, they were making sure that there was a strong morale to support of the German army. So it would be wrong to say that there was no recruitment campaigns at all in Germany, because despite conscription being in place from well before the war, there was still a need to increase morale, support for the army, and also encourage those who weren't forced to join via conscription to also go off to war, particularly the younger men. So while Germany was the best prepared country for war in 1914, just like all the other countries, it really hadn't prepared for a long war. And even by as early as October 1914, we haven't even completed the race to the sea yet, and Germany is already starting to hit a munitions crisis. That is, it's running out of reserves of weapons and ammunition. So we talk about the shell scandal in Britain in 1915. Germany was feeling it even earlier than Britain had been. This was contributed to as well by the naval blockade of Germany, as they weren't able to import things like gunpowder to increase their production of explosives. And if you have a look at this map here, you can see how it's not difficult to blockade Germany. Germany is the grey country, and its shipping is coming in here in a very short coastline, really. And Britain was quite effective in blockading trade getting to Germany. It certainly discouraged countries like the Netherlands, like America, like Sweden from trading freely with Germany. And in fact, it actually, broke international rules by stopping those neutral ships from going into Germany. It contributes to the reasons why Germany increases its U-boat activity in the oceans area as well. This photograph here is a boatyard at near Kiel in Germany, just to give you a sense that Germany was reliant on maritime trade. So by 1915, the German economy was shrinking and civilian living standards were already beginning to fall in 1915. And when they fell in Germany, they fell much more rapidly and had a larger impact on the German population than we would see if we were contrasting with what was impacting on the British population at the same time. If we have a look at this graph, it shows you the way that explosive production was undertaken. So the blue is Germany and the red is Britain. And we can see that early in the war, the Germans were well ahead in explosive making, all the way up to really 1917. And part of the reason for this change, despite Britain understanding the need to increase its munitions production, is we also see Germany having some difficulties getting hold of the raw materials that they needed in order to continue making the explosives. The Germans were, however, extremely clever, and they developed an organised total war approach to the economy much more quickly than Britain did. So with the Department of Raw Materials, the KRA, in place, German industry was organised into groups of industries. It didn't mean that it was complete government takeover of the companies, however. It was more that the companies would be contracted to the government. It actually benefited the large firms who made very large profits out of the war. But the government was able to control what those industries were creating through this contract arrangement. But most importantly was the initiative taken by many German scientists to develop new synthetic substitutes, so substitute materials for the raw materials that they couldn't get. Gunpowder being a really important one. Also rubber, making synthetic rubber rather than being reliant on the imports. And also a new being able to use oil, which they could mine, they could get from oil wells in Germany. And they were starting to use that to replace coal in machinery. So German chemical engineering was at the fore at the beginning of World War I and throughout, and really helped Germany actually stay in the war effort for much longer than it would have otherwise been able to do due to the blockade. So that finishes this part, and we'll move on in the next lecture to see how the home front progresses as the war goes on.